Wonderful practice. One tulip done with graphite pencils and the second tulip is done with watercolors. Outline is available for download and I will be using 2HB, 2B and 4B graphite pencils. Starting with B, and I'm putting pencil on the side to give a light shading over the whole surface of tulip flower head. We want to give even tone. I'm not thinking right now about where is darker, where is lighter. Even the lightest part on this tulip flower head has a little bit of tone. If we compare to the white background that is behind tulips, then we will notice that there's no such thing as completely white area on this tulip. So we need to give an even tone all across this flower head. Open reference photo right beside tutorial or on the other gadget and follow along with where I'm working, where I'm toning, where is lighter, darker, so you can easily see. In this video we have reference on the upper corner, but still to manage to see everything from reference and implement that into our drawing and painting, we need to look very close. For realistic painting, it's super important to get all the information from reference photo. Everything what we need is there. We don't need to think where are shadows, where are lights. Everything is visible in the reference photo. And as I'm applying this very light layer of graphite, I'm not pushing my pencil. I'm holding it parallel to paper and drawing on the side of the pencil. And as you can see, everything is very light. No pushing, no hard lines. At this point, we want to get a very even and light tone. In some areas that I see from reference, there are complete dark spots, like here, little corner is visible of inner side of this petal. There we see in a reference that is completely dark, and using the same B pencil, I'm applying that slightly darker layer by pushing a little bit. No matter how long and with which pencil I will be working, I'm not pushing too hard, and always try to hold your tools lightly. Also, when you are transferring line drawing, also not recommended to push too hard, then you will have little gap lines across your outline, and that can be a little bit frustrating, especially when you will be painting with watercolors. Then the pigment can be stuck in those little gap lines, and we don't want that. That will cause a crisp edge as well. And here the inner part of tulip petal is also completely away from light source, and it's much darker than the outer parts of petals. And it's important to tone that first layer with pencil and not using any smudging blending tool for that. Instead, if you want to have a little bit more even, smoother look, you can use a brush. That will be more accurate and a very light, smooth touch to this tonal study. If you will use a blending tool, this paper stick, then that smoothing can be a little bit too rough and it can end up like dirty looking layer of graphite. Zooming a little bit closer, and now as I have a very light tone applied of graphite, now I'm going and looking in the reference photo for a slightly darker areas, half tones and shadows. Not thinking right now at the lightest part. Light is already applied with this very light graphite layer, but now I'm moving forward using the same pencil B and constantly checking the reference. The reference is my guide where I'm looking and noticing changes. The more I look, the more I start to notice where are different tonal values to get this tulip look realistic. Try to hold your pencil sharp. Sharpen it if you see that it's beginning to become more fatter at the tip, and to have it more finer, more sharper, your lines will be finer. And we see from the reference photo that tulip has a lot of beautiful textured lines. Those are petal veins, and we will have a lot of these lines, and these lines will end up with more tonal values, more a realistic look. So look after your pencils so they are sharp. And again, I want to remind you, don't push too hard. I'm still holding my B grade pencil very lightly, and I'm getting another layer of graphite, and I'm building that tonal value slowly. We don't want to have a very dark lines, gradually building the same as with watercolors. Taking paper towel to rest my hands so I'm not smudging the rest of the composition and paper. To have a clean and neat surrounding area is also super important for realistic watercolor painting, especially botanical painting or drawing of graphite. To have a beautifully painted flowers and have dirty surrounding will not have a nice finished result, but you can have a very neat and accurate surrounding area, and your painting is going to look much better. Still looking, constantly checking with reference, and applying lots and lots of very fine lines. For now, I'm using B grade pencil. This petal, the right side, is darker. We can see that from the reference, and also if we think where is the light coming from, light is coming from the left side, which means that it's casting shadow on the left side, and shadow is on the right. Also, the left edge of this petal is slightly darker. It's curling away from us and into the shadow as well, then leaving a little gap of light, and then again we have a darker area. Constantly looking in reference. Open it, and if you need, you can pause the video and try to notice what I'm talking about. Do you see these changes? Do you see these half tones that I'm working on right now? Do you see that the petal on the right is darker and on the left it is lighter? We learn by observing, by looking and seeing, and the more we are doing that, the more we start to see. Moving forward to next petal, still using B pencil. Majority of this graphite study will be done with B, 2B and 4B. In the beginning I thought that I will be needing 2H, but I haven't touched it yet and I will not use it during this tutorial. using brush, and also I'm holding it very lightly and very lightly touching the surface of paper to give a little smoothness, not too much. We don't want to completely smudge those beautiful lines, those fine lines. We want to keep those lines but still give a little smoother look. And if we will use this paper blending tool, that we can smudge much harder and lose those lines, and we don't want that. This tulip has a lot of beautiful lines, those characteristic lines of tulips. Each tulip, if you look closer, you will notice that there's a lot of petal veins. Now I'm taking 2B pencil and going over where we have halftones and more darker shadow areas. Again, I'm not pushing, just using the softness of this pencil to get slightly darker lines, those very, very fine lines. Be sure that your pencil is sharpened and the tip is nice and sharp. Then we can get beautiful lines and build another layer. The same as with watercolors, building layers, not getting result with just one layer, but it's a work of many layers to get all tonal values, to get details, to get this realistic result. Moving on to stem area. Stem is the lightest part in this composition, but we need to pay attention to the stem as well. And if you take a closer look, you will notice that stem on the right has a little line of shadow. Then the upper part of the stem where the flower head is attached, there's slightly darker area, and I'm using B grade pencil here, leaving middle part of the stem completely light. That's where the light is hitting surface of the stem, and there is very light area, but we need to make the stem look realistic, look like a cylinder. So you imagine an academic drawing of cylinder, then you will know that on one side there's shadow, then there are halftones, and then there's light. Stem is the same, it's like a cylinder. And now moving on to leaf. Also using B grade pencil. Very light tone layer for the whole area of the leaf. I know that in the reference photo we see this leaf that there's some kind of texture and there's a lot of little spots, but for now, to build up to those spots, we need to look beyond those spots, what color, what tonal value is behind them. Then if I squint my eyes and look at the reference, then I will notice that leaf on the right is much darker, leaf on the left is much lighter. So I'm giving this very light tone to the whole surface of the leaf. Now with the brush slightly, without any hard pushing, I'm smoothing this layer to get a nice smooth touch. And then we can continue with pencil further to give a shadow area on the right next layer. Now using 2B pencil, toning shadow area even more, giving another layer of graphite, building darkness and contrast gradually and slowly with layers, not pushing, erasing if going over the line to the other tulip. There we need to leave clean area for watercolors. And again, I'm not pushing my pencil. Everything is done lightly with layers. Upper part on the left is slightly darker because the flower head is casting shadow on this leaf. But on the lower part, the right side is darker because it's curved away from the light source and is in the shadow area. Half of the leaf is darker and half is lighter, that we can clearly see in the reference photo. Still, no matter how long I will be drawing, painting, I will be looking at reference. That is my guide. The more I look, the more I start to notice. Tonal values, details, everything is there. I don't need to imagine stuff. Reference is my guide. Holding pencil parallel to the paper. And now using the same 2B pencil, I start to apply those like spots. But if we take a closer look, we will notice that there are some lines. Some are thinner lines, some are thicker lines, some lines are changing directions. And that texture on the sleeve is achieved by contrast. The background behind those spots is lighter and those spots are much darker. We don't need to completely 100% place those spots in the same area what we see in reference, but we can get the idea, the characteristic look of that leaf and recreate that. We don't need to completely do that as it is done in a photo, but we can get the texture, the same appearance that we see in the reference. Now I'm pushing pencil a little bit harder, but still not too hard. And I noticed that I want to remove some graphite on the right side, and I'm not using simple eraser, but I'm taking my elastic eraser and stippling out graphite. I don't want to erase it completely, but my elastic eraser will remove some part of that graphite. Not completely erase, but lightly take away some upper graphite layer. Now using brush smoothing so it's more even and nice. adding some final touches to this graphite study till now, and maybe some details, maybe some corrections by erasing. The beauty of graphite study, you can erase. If you go over the edge, go over the line, you can simply go back and erase. With watercolors, it's not the same. And I always suggest my students do graphite studies. You can learn so much from these studies and later work with watercolors or any other medium, and your base with graphite studies will help you with using any other medium. And for now, I'm finishing with the graphite and moving on from pencils and erasers to watercolors and brushes. First, let's mix watercolors using ultramarine blue with permanent rose or any other pink pigment that you have, painting out on a piece of paper, adding a little bit more of permanent rose and a little bit of more. Now I'm more happy with the result of violet. Separately, manganese violet, painting out. Third mix, manganese violet with a little touch of ultramarine blue. And painting out pigments that I will be using: permanent rose, manganese violet, ultramarine blue. And for the green part of the flower head, I need sap green with a little touch of manganese violet, painting out, and adding lemon yellow, also painting out. Be sure that your water is clean after mixing watercolors and applying with round synthetic brush water, just enough so you can move watercolors. As you can see, I'm moving my paper and there are no puddles. Water is not dripping off the paper, so that is enough water so that the surface is moist. I'm taking manganese violet and with the round synthetic brush applying from the shadow area of the right side petal. The amount of watercolors is really transparent and light, as you can see. The moisture of the paper surface is just enough so I can move pigment with my brush. Watercolors are not floating. If they are starting to float on their own, it means that you took too much water. And now with the round synthetic brush, I'm pushing watercolors towards the outer edges, but leaving the very bottom part of the petal unpainted, and lifting out watercolors. From the left side, we see in the reference photo that there is the light area, the shiny area on this petal surface. And as I lift, I clean my brush and paper towel, lift again, and applying watercolors on the right side, where is the shadow area, but leaving the left side, as you can see, the light gap, the light area. This petal, these tulips have always a shiny surface on petals, and we want to keep that light area much wider than it appears in the reference. And the lower part of this petal, it's not completely white. There are some greens and yellows, but use these watercolors super lightly. We can always go darker. Problem is to make something appear lighter with watercolors. Moving on to the second petal on the left side, again, as you can see, watercolors are just enough so that the paper is moist. No puddles, no water puddles are on my surface. Using manganese violet and applying here, right side is darker, the curved area of the petal edge, and the left side is very light. So use watercolors transparently. We will add more layers. This is just the first layer, and it's completely okay that your painting doesn't look like reference. It's not even close in terms of saturation. That's completely normal. Also leaving light area. Here it is on the right side. Again, wiping with clean and dry brush, cleaning in paper towel, and wiping pigment off the surface again. And always leave light area wider than it appears in the reference. With layers, it will become smaller and eventually it will be as it is in the reference. Now I'm taking finer to brush and applying first layer to those little visible corners of the most further petals. First layer a little bit darker than the petals that are on the front. But we see in the reference that those little corners that are visible are quite dark. So it's okay to paint them dark, but still it's not like clean and saturated pigment. It's still diluted with water. And later on I will add another layer and another layer to make it even darker. Don't try to paint in one layer the darkness. If you will do that, then your painting can end up looking flat. Applying water to the middle petal, manganese violet. Again, outer part of this petal is slightly darker. Then pushing watercolors to the lower part, and this petal in the middle is lighter than both petal edges that are in front. And again, middle part, if needed, I'm wiping out, lifting pigment. I waited a few moments for the surface to be completely dry, and I erase graphite lines of the lower part of this flower head because it's so light, and my graphite lines will be visible even after many layers of that lower part watercolors, and I don't want my graphite to be visible. That's why I'm almost erasing, leaving super light lines that you almost can't see, and that is manageable with watercolors. Using finer tip brush, watercolors that we pre-mixed, painting further. Surface is dry, and next layers are applied on the dry surface. Painting lightly. In some point, it almost looks like I'm painting with an invisible watercolor mixes, but there is a very light watercolor amount, and that's enough. With layers, It will build up saturation, you will see. You can turn your painting as you like so that you can place your hand and make those fine brush strokes more freer. If you're not sure about your fine brush strokes, you can pause this video, move aside your painting, take a very simple paper, a little piece of paper, and practice your lines. It's a matter of practice. There's no some magic or shortcut with fine lines. It's all about practicing. And of course, using brush with a super fine tip. You can't get fine lines using round synthetic brush, for example, but if you have the brush with the finest tip, take separate piece of paper and practice. The same we did with graphite. I was mentioning that you need to keep your pencil sharp, the same as with brush. Use the very tip of the brush, and I'm applying many fine lines to get the look that we have in the reference, and building layers gradually, constantly checking with the reference where are darker spots, maybe some changes in colors, tonal values, and keeping light, area light. I'm taking watercolors, ultramarine blue and permanent rose. I'm using small amount of watercolor mixes because I can always mix again. I know which pigments I'm using, and here I'm adding a little bit of alizarin crimson, very small amount to my palette, because I noticed from the reference, the more we look, the more we start to notice. I noticed that there are some a little bit of red on both petals. And as I mix small amounts of watercolors, I can mix again and again. The more we mix, the more we practice watercolor mixing, the more we memorize pigments. And even if you will get a slightly different color tone, your painting will only benefit from it. Don't be scared of not getting the same tone. It also comes with practice, and the more we practice watercolors, the better. Continuing with fine lines, lots and lots of fine lines. Removing some excess of mixes in paper towel. I also always hold paper towel in my left hand, but I decided to place paper towel in front of camera so you see how often I wipe my brush in paper towel. Sometimes I forget to do that in front of the camera because I'm so used to do it with holding in my hand paper towel, but I try to do it more frequently so you also see when I clean my brush, when I remove some excess of watercolors in the paper towel. Now moving on to the middle petal, and there we see in the center a beautiful petal vein, and on both sides there's a little shadow, little darker fine lines. And again, on the sides, we have super fine lines there, starting from the outer edges and moving towards the lower part. Taking small amount of alizarin crimson and round synthetic brush and applying super light transparent amount of this red pigment. It's applied not in the light area but in the halftones and shadow area just a little bit. When I'm adding some other color, now I'm taking permanent rose, I'm not painting it everywhere, just in some areas that I noticed from the reference. Here I noticed the pink, more pinker area on the inner part of these petals, the curved part. I noticed that there's more pink in it rather than the rest of the petals. So if I see there pink, it means that I will only add pink there. I will not paint the whole petal with pink. moving on with fine lines, and layers are built on a dry surface. With each new fine brush stroke, we get new layer, and it becomes a little bit darker, building contrast, and slowly this tulip flower head becomes more vibrant, more roundish with volume. We are looking for tonal values. The study of the first tulip with graphite really helped to understand this flower, and now it's much easier with watercolors. To work first with graphite gives you more understanding of tonal values. You get to know your subject closer. And with graphite, it's easier. You can erase, you don't need to think about water ratio, you don't need to think about mixes. You're just thinking how to make this flat line drawing look realistic and three-dimensional. Now with watercolors, if you did this with graphite, you already know how to make it more realistic. Now you need to think about watercolor mixes, water ratio to manage that it's not too watery or not too dry, and practicing first graphite and then watercolors will definitely help you in your realistic artistic journey. Checking paper that it is dry, and I can apply next layer of watercolors, of some lines, textured lines, petal vein lines, and we are still building contrast, saturation of this tulip flower head. Gradually, slowly, no need to rush. Look at the reference, constantly check with the reference. I noticed red violet, so I'm adding red violet with a little touch of ultramarine blue to my mixing palette. And this red violet watercolor mix is more for the inner corners, inner edge of these two outer petals. If you don't have red violet pigment, you can take more saturated pink pigment together with the blue, ultramarine blue, and mix with greater amount of pink pigment, and then you will get a really close to red violet. It's more saturated, it's more vivid pigment, and those edges, inner edges of those petals, I see from reference are more to the pink side. Wait a few moments, checked if it's dry, and now with round synthetic brush doing a watery glaze with very light watercolors over shadow and halftone area, little bit going into the light, but this layer should be super light. As you can see from my mixing palette watercolors, there's really small amount of on my palette, and another layer of transparent watercolors. Ultramarine blue, clean ultramarine blue for the lighter areas. Clean blue pigment gives a cool shine to the lighter part. Lighter area is where the light is shining. Now moving on to the stem. I'm using lemon yellow that was already on my mixing palette, adding sap green and little touch of alizarin crimson. Super small amount of alizarin crimson. That's important. If you will add too much, this mix will become brown. Adding a little bit more of sap green and little touch of ultramarine blue. And using round synthetic brush, applying water, just enough for watercolors to be moved, and applying light amount of these watercolors. Now this part of the stem is completely in the shadow, and we will paint it gradually with layers. Be careful with stem. It's very often a neglected area in the paintings, because we give all our effort to flower and then just few minutes for the stem and call it done. And that is a bad thing to do. Give the same love, the same attention you gave for the flower, give also to the stem area. And here we have a beautiful transition. Little upper part of the stem is completely exposed to light, but still there's a little bit of shadow on the right side of the stem. But majority of the stem is in the shadow because leaf is casting shadow. And in one area, we see that this shadow starts. It's not completely where the leaf goes, it's a little bit off. Now I'm taking perylene green with a little touch of ultramarine blue and sap green. This is for the inner part of the leaf. Tulip leaves have a lot of blue pigment, and tulip leaves are more cooler. That's why I have perylene green, ultramarine blue. Both pigments are quite cool, and adding a little touch of sap green to give a little bit of warmth, but still my mix looks more bluish rather than very yellowish green. Applying water, and the lower part of this inner leaf has more yellowish in it. I see that only from reference. I'm not imagining. I'm constantly checking with reference. No matter how long I'm painting more than 1 hour with breaks here and there, but I constantly check with reference. And the area right behind, or here maybe in front of the stem, we have a cast shadow area. Be sure that the stem now is dry when you are painting inner part of the leaf. If your surface becomes, the surface of the inner part of the leaf is quite large, and if it becomes dry while you were applying watercolors, again, place super small amount of clean water just to make the paper moist, and then again apply watercolors. Here this smaller corner is also completely away from light source and it's darker. Painting with round synthetic brush, applying watercolors. First layers don't look as they should, or as reference looks. Now I waited a little bit and my layer is dry, so I'm applying next layer of watercolors. Taking finer tip brush, and I want to apply that cast shadow area, taking a little bit more of perlin green and sap green, more perlin green, and little touch of ultramarine blue. Removing excess amount of watercolors and starting to apply this beautiful cast shadow area that will help separate tulip, stem of the tulip, from leaf. Here, don't rush. Try to be as precise as possible. Don't overpaint stem, and don't make this cast shadow area too thick. As you can see from the reference, it's like few millimeters thick. Now I applied line with finer tip brush, washing my brush and smoothing the applied lines so that the transition from this very dark to the lighter part is smooth and gradual. Moving on with inner part of the sleeve, we still need more layers. It is much darker in the reference. We need to apply layers. Upper part is darker, left side is darker, and it only is achieved with layers. Don't try to paint in 1 or 2 or even 3 layers, the intensity that you see in reference. Be patient. Apply layer after layer. This corner stays much lighter. Other parts are quite dark. Taking a little bit of yellow mix, apply to the shadow part. More layers, more fine brush strokes, careful observation of the reference, and patiently painting further. Now taking ultramarine blue with a little touch of sap green, I'm applying with round synthetic brush super transparent amount of this watercolor mix to this edge That is the front side of the sleeve, and it's curved, so we see only a little part. And there I see like the color of this upper part of the leaf, it looks like turquoise. And to get a turquoise, I'm using blue with a little touch of green, or even you can use yellow. That's how you can get a very light turquoise color tone. And we can see from the reference that that little edge that we see is super light. So keep it light, don't try to make it dark. Taking yellow watercolor mix, lemon yellow, sap green, and alizarin crimson, and apply to the stem. We are slowly building this stem also slightly darker, and the upper part has shadow area on the right. more watercolors to the stem, especially that part that is in the shadow. And even that part that is in the shadow, there's also a shadow in the shadow. That is the left side of the stem is slightly darker than the rest part of the stem. Adding final touches to this watercolor study of Violet Tulip. Last brush strokes, some details, more crisper cast shadow area. And now I can see and compare both tulips to the reference. I noticed that the graphite part, as I applied watercolor tulip, the graphite part looks more lighter. When there were no watercolors applied, it looked very good, contrasty, but as we have another subject in this composition, now both they interact with each other, and the first graphite study looks more paler. But from the reference, I noticed that it needs to go darker, especially the leaf part, because it is behind this first one, which is with watercolors, and I need to add more layers to the leaf. Now is a wonderful moment when you have everything almost looks finished. Of course, you can call it done if you're happy with the result, or you can take a break, maybe few hours, maybe day, weeks, or month, and come back with a fresher look, ready to continue and push yourself a little bit further. Compare with the reference. You can even take a photo of your work, put it side by side with a reference photo, and compare where more darkness is required. Here I'm taking 4B pencil, which is even softer and darker than 2B, and applying more contrast to the leaf area. Compare with reference. Push yourself a little bit further in observation, in painting, in studying your work, looking at it with the more relaxed and fresh eye. Now we have painted 1.5 hours, so it's time to take a break. Don't rush, especially if you feel the urge that you want to rush. It means that you need to take a break. Also, flower head needs a little bit more darkness, especially with this petal on the right side. In the reference, it looks much darker, and I want to make it slightly darker as well. As I added more contrast to the graphite, now my watercolor leaf, especially the inner part, looks like it requires more of my attention, and I'm taking perlin green, ultramarine blue, and sap green, using round synthetic brush, applying transparent layer of watercolors, starting from the shadow area and smoothing the applied watercolors towards the lightest part. Taking clean ultramarine blue, small amount, and applying a little bit to that little edge that we see. small amount of alizarin crimson to the petals, outer parts of the petals, a little bit of red pigment, really small amount, and applying these slightly different color tones gives a very interesting and more artistic look to the painting. Having multiple color tones gives more life to your artwork. Don't try to be perfect with your watercolor mixes, like having the same color tone all through the your painting journey. The more you have color tones, the more interesting the result will look. Well, I'm adding last details, last brush strokes for this composition. Hope you learned something new and enjoyed this practice of graphite and watercolor violet tulips. I really enjoyed this practice. I always like to return to graphite pencils and do some practice. It so gives a nice feeling of freedom that you have only think about form and how to make it realistic, and after that go to watercolors, and I feel like some new knowledge came to me. So I hope you also enjoyed this and gained something for your painting practice. Thank you. Hope you paint and finish this composition, and see you in my next tutorials. Bye bye.